WhatsApp connections shrank sharply in 2010, and it hopes that by building up its portfolio of websites like the Huffington Post, advertising cash will soon start flowing its way once again. John Terrett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, the AOL Huffington Post deal has given Wall Street a boost as stocks continue to rise. On Monday, President Barack Obama promised business leaders that he would reduce corporate taxes, but he warned companies that manufacturing jobs should not go overseas.
So the key to our success has never been just developing new ideas. It's also been making new products. So Intel pioneers the microchip and then puts thousands to work building them in Silicon Valley. Henry Ford perfects the assembly line and then puts a generation to work in the factories of Detroit. That's how we built the largest middle class in the world.
France's foreign minister is facing calls to resign after taking a holiday in Tunisia in late December during the country's uprising. Michelle Alliot-Marie has said she regrets taking the holiday, but she's refusing to stand down from her position. She's also admitted using a Tunisian businessman's private jet several times during her stay there. Let's go to Brazil now, where fire has destroyed hundreds of costumes and floats ahead of this year's carnival in Rio de Janeiro. The fire broke out in warehouses used by the city's samba schools. It took place early on Monday, and it took firefighters 4 hours to put it out. Samba groups called the loss catastrophic, but Rio's mayor says the carnival will still go ahead as planned, taking place on March the 6th. About 750 people have held a protest in Mexico City against bullfighting. The demonstrators cover themselves in fake blood and lay outside the Palacio de Bellas Artes, calling for a ban of the sport. Bullfighting is legal in Mexico, and the government pays for both bullfighting schools and museums. Mexico stages more bullfights than any other country except Spain. That's it. Coming up, it's Riz Khan Live. Thanks for watching.
Hello and welcome. I'm Imran Gardner, sitting in for Riz Khan. Are the winds of change blowing over the Arab world and spurred by the popular protests in Egypt? Since January the 25th, millions have taken to the streets demanding the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak, who has ruled the country for 30 years. At least 300 people have been killed, but protesters remain undeterred, calling for democracy, media freedom and an end to corruption. Now, massive demonstrations in Egypt have triggered rumblings of discontent across other Arab nations as well. And in the face of growing anger in Yemen, President Ali Abdullah Saleh agreed not to run for another term and said his son Ahmed would no longer succeed him. Algerian President Abdelaziz Bouteflika announced he would end a state of emergency after 19 years and called for the broadcast media to provide fair coverage of legalized national organizations. King Abdullah of Jordan dismissed his prime minister and cabinet and urged the new premier to initiate speedy political reforms. And in Syria, President Bashar al-Assad has promised to hold municipal elections and loosen state control over media. So today we ask, could the protests in Egypt generate momentum for reform across the Arab world? And just remember, you can call in with your questions and comments, and you can send us an email or even a text message on the show. Well, joining us now on the show from Singapore is Dr. Saaduddin Talib, a former member of Yemen's former Anti-Corruption Commission and now a critic of President Saleh. Syrian human rights and anti-censorship activist Anas Qatish is with us from Boston, and with him is writer and blogger Khalid Loom. Welcome all of you to the show, gentlemen. Khalid Loom, if I could start with you, these subsidies and benefits and vaguely defined and sometimes unspecified promises of political change from these leaders, have these allowed the leaders to pull the rug from beneath the feet of the protesters, or would the protesters and those calling for reform not be taking any of it seriously?
I would imagine that they're not taking it very seriously at all. If you look at the situation in Algeria or Yemen or Jordan, you're still seeing people going out and protesting. You're still seeing people flocking to those who are trying to mobilize people to recreate something similar to what we saw in Tunisia or what we saw in Egypt recently. So I'm not convinced that lowering the price of sugar or cooking oil is going to stop Algerians from going out into the street and demanding that their government respond to their political demands, which is what I think most of these protests are really about.
Mr. Loam, what was so special about Tunisia? Why was it the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, if you look at the recent history of the Arab people, what we've seen are revolutions being used as an excuse for military coups. You have the history in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Algeria, where the military claims to introduce some sweeping change in politics by overthrowing a monarch or overthrowing another politician, and then continues to rule for decades without any accountability. What we saw in Tunisia was the opposite of that. The people rising up, a real revolution, removing a longtime dictator, and really forcing their government to respond to them. And I think a lot of people in the Arab world see that as something that's quite inspirational and something that they hope to recreate for themselves.
Well, as this conversation expands and contracts, we're going to be looking at specific countries and, of course, general trends across the region. Let's ask Anis Qatish about Syria. There was a day of rage planned for Syria, just like there was in Egypt, but nobody seems to have turned up. Why?
Yes, from following the events as somebody who has been following online activism in Syria for a long time, I found that most of the people who are calling for that day of anger were not actually based in Syria, and people in Syria did not react in a positive light to these calls. I think it was mostly opposition members outside, and opposition outside Syria has little connection with people inside the country. So especially that there were calls mostly sectarian and just political vengeance, it does not really resonate with the demands of people in Syria.
Talking about resonating with the demands of the people in Syria, what keeps Bashar al-Assad having so much popularity? Is it because a lot of his policies and official statements with regards to foreign policy are with the Arab street, are with the Syrian street, as opposed to, say, for example, a place like Egypt, where Hosni Mubarak had a peace deal with Israel, which was in no way reflective of the views of the majority of people there?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. People, even who are not fans of the regime, swear by the foreign policy of Syria. They see it as tried and proven, as it has survived many tests in facing outside pressure, especially after the assassination of Hariri in 2005.
Saaduddin Talib, as we talk about Yemen and a lot of the grievances that people have in Yemen, corruption comes up quite often, very close to the top of the lists of grievances. You were part of an anti-corruption unit in Yemen. Why did you resign?
Thank you for having me. My resignation is basically because I thought that the Anti-Corruption Commission was not doing its job. And the reason for that is quite straightforward, is that it was actually structured in a way that prevents it from doing its job. And it is important to characterize the regimes that we are talking about. For instance, Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen basically they have parallel characteristics in the regimes. And I want to expand a little bit on that because it really describes the form of rule in these three countries. It's basically these three countries were run by a regime that is a despotic regime, controlled by one person and his family, and they have the opportunity to loot, basically, the wealth of the nation. Only now we see all over the international media what is the wealth of President Mubarak and the